Welcome back, everybody, to the 360 Size Up podcast. Hey, this is part 2 of a podcast that we did in April on 1910-156, OSHA's new changes. I've got Chief Tobia, who is back, and I also have another guest with the IFC. Welcome back, fellas.
Hey, great to be here as always. Thanks.
Ken, I want to go to you. Can you just tell us a little bit about yourself and what you're doing in this 1910-156 new changes?
Sure, Chief King. My name is Ken LaSala. I'm the Director of Government Relations for the International Association of Fire Chiefs. Basically, I've been working here for the IFC for about 19 years. So I've been involved throughout the whole process for this update to the new OSHA emergency response. At this point, it's a draft standard. And, I'll be glad to go into greater detail. But right now, the IFC has been involved in this process back from pretty much around 2007, 2008, the days of the President George W. Bush administration. And now we're gotten to a point now where we're working with the different IFC components to develop comments, which we'll be submitting. The due date for the comments now is July 22nd. So we're busy putting together some comments to put forward to OSHA. And I can go into greater detail later.
All right. Thanks. Again, thanks for being on here. This is like, it's a big topic. The last podcast on this topic got lots of reviews, lots of questions. People were reaching out to me. I couldn't answer them. That's the reason you two guys are on the podcast. A lot of people think these changes are just happening. Just what you said, Ken, it goes back to George Bush administration. This has been brewing for a long time. Lots of meetings, lots of organizations involved in this. Chief Tobia, you've been knee deep in it for quite a few years, as you talked about in the last podcast. So just can you just give a brief overview of for our listeners that didn't hear the last podcast, just to give it just at a high level of what we talked about last time?
Sure, Chief. Thanks so much. So for people that are new to this topic, OSHA promulgates or creates regulations designed to ensure safety of responders, whether it's in the workplace or emergency responders. And they develop a wide range of standards all around the idea of keeping people safe. The only existing standard that is on point in any way, shape, or form that is directly related to the fire service was created in 1980, and that is the 1910-156 standard. In the wake of 9/11, Congress gave all of the regulatory agencies a charge to look at existing programs, policies, and regulations and determine ways to improve the safety of emergency responders. Of course, 343 firefighters died on 9/11. And those work sites were incredibly toxic. And so out of that came a generalized effort to evaluate the need to improve emergency responder safety. So since that time, the Department of Labor and OSHA has been on a very steady, very purposeful, very programmatic process of evaluating existing standards and determining whether or not they met the intent of a modern American fire service, or if we needed to evaluate something differently. If you think back to 1980, right? So that's 44 years ago, was the only time that there has been a regulation created. And one of the things that we very quickly found, and the American Fire Service told OSHA, was that standard was woefully out of date and woefully inadequate to meet any modern version of ensuring emergency responder safety. And so OSHA undertook the effort through the National Advisory Council on Occupational Safety and Health, which is an advisory council to the Secretary of Labor, to create a work group to actually set about developing new model regulations around improving emergency responder safety. NACOSH invited representatives from all of the major emergency service organizations across the United States to send representatives to Washington to begin the process of undertaking a rewrite or development of new draft regulations. And I was honored to serve on that group as part of the International Association of Fire Chiefs delegation to that. But there were representatives from the National Volunteer Fire Council, the International Association of Firefighters, the National Fallen Firefighters Foundation, the National Fire Protection Association, numerous organizations, and other entities that were going to potentially be impacted by these model regulations. Out of that effort in 2016 came a proposal for draft regulations. That was then turned back over to the Department of Labor. Since that time, they have continued to evaluate the language in the document, and they have also more recently revised their position with regard to incorporating by reference standards that are designed to address emergency responder safety. And in this case, what I'm really talking about are the NFPA standards. And we can go into that more in a little while. But where we are today is OSHA has proposed a draft set of regulations. I am very confidently able to say that it would be a minimum, an absolute minimum of 2 to 3 years before any final regulations would be adopted. And then it would likely be an additional number of years, as yet to be determined, for the actual implementation timeline. So while I understand that there's a tremendous amount of fear about the potential for these regulations, which I will tell you are sweeping changes for the American Fire Service and those that provide emergency services in general, that this is a very purposeful, measured process that is designed to take in everyone's concerns, questions, and address them to the very best of OSHA's ability. So really excited about this opportunity to spend some time with you. Thanks for giving me a chance to provide that oversight, and happy to talk more about it.
Awesome. I feel very confident we got the right people in the room on this podcast that dates back to 2015, I believe you said. Your draft went out in 16?
Yeah, that's correct. The NACOSH work group was formed in 2015 and then completed their work in 2016, and then turned those draft regulations back over to OSHA, who have been in possession of it ever since. But that wasn't even the beginning. The beginning goes far back before that. Again, all of the major fire service organizations have been playing a role and been aware of this ongoing effort since the beginning.
Awesome. Yeah. So thanks for that summary. And I'm sure you could sit and talk about all kinds of keeping that tight was pretty good. Appreciate it. Ken, what have you been doing? Do you go back 2015 or was you part of this group?
Well, we go back to about 2007 or 2008. So basically, like Chief Tobia was saying, this is something that came from the George W. Bush administration. So at the end of his administration, OSHA put out a request for information about all the firefighter standards that are out there. You know, they had specific questions about the industrial fire brigade standard, and some technical questions about firefighting and everything. And honestly, the IFC, we responded back with a document that was about this. I mean, literally, we've got it bound somewhere with a giant binder clip. And so we submitted that in about, like I said, about 2007, 2008. Then things went pretty quiet for a while until towards the end of the Obama administration, like Chief Tobia was mentioning. And then the NACOSH was assigned the duty of starting to put together the draft standard. So the IFC participated at the main NACOSH meeting where they started looking at this. They created a subcommittee, which Chief Tobia served on. And, they went through their work process, put together a document. And I think the thing to remember, too, is once OSHA got done with a draft document, it actually went over to the Small Business Administration. They actually, under federal law now, actually have a small entity review, which its whole purpose is to take a look at the effects of a draft standard on either small businesses or in our cases, like, small fire departments or fire departments that serve fairly small communities. And the IFC actually had a representative on that small business entity review. So if you look at the report, which is right there on the OSHA website, you can actually see who it was. And anyhow, so part of the process, so you've got the NACOSH's work, you've got, as it worked its way through the OSHA process, then went over to the Small Business Administration. They submitted a bunch of comments and recommendations. And then, of course, it went over to I guess at one point went over to OMB. They looked at it, and now they've put it out for comment. And like Chief Tobia was saying, right now, entities are invited to submit comments. And so from the IFC perspective, we actually are working with all of our different components, because this thing covers everything from should there be an update to the portable fire extinguisher standard, there are requirements regarding physicals and medical monitoring. There's questions about NIMS. So it covers a very broad perspective. Even from the industrial fire brigade perspective, there's questions about do industrial departments use volunteers? There's questions about the living areas of industrial firefighters. There's questions about how industrial fire brigades decontaminate their gear. This thing even gets into things like, PFAS and PPE. So we're putting together fairly comprehensive comments, which we will be then putting together and submitting to OSHA by July 22nd. But, I would recommend, for anybody listening, go back to your department, start taking a look at this, and start asking yourself, how would I go about implementing it? And what are some of the issues which I'm going to have as a fire chief in my jurisdiction? And especially start looking at questions like cost. And as you put together that data, be sure to submit it to OSHA, because really that's what they want. What they've made it very clear is they're looking for inputs on how to make the standard more realistic and make it so that you can both protect firefighters, but also make it easier for the fire department to realistically adopt these requirements. So any input that a fire department can issue before July 22nd will only make the standard better for the fire department down the road to implement. And that's kind of our perspective, is very much like there's some major issues we're looking at, and there's literally roughly about 40 questions that OSHA asks, which I've kind of just discussed, and we're going to be trying to answer all of them. But everything from like wildland firefighting to even like patient restraints in vehicles and ambulances. So it's really important to take a look at the standard, see what it means for your department, and then make sure you submit something to OSHA. That way they can compile it all and hopefully get a better standard to make your life easier in a couple of years.
Thank you. So one of the things, Ken, that you're also doing, or the IFC is doing, I think you're facilitating it, is you're gathering information back from the IFC. I think, and I don't know, there's other organizations that may be in that too, those are scheduled meetings talking about the impact of cost, and there's some other subcommittees that you've, so this isn't just, you saying on this podcast to go do this. You're actually, there's a lot of heavy lifting going on behind the scenes. So you'll definitely have that back to them before July 22nd. So one of the things we talked about on the podcast last time was the reason that this is happening. And Chief, you talked about in those meetings, line of duty deaths was the number one reason of the big changes. And the standards that are going into this, can you talk about how many of them? You have to go through each one, but maybe highlight some of the ones that stick out in your mind, but definitely the number of standards that are now incorporated into these new changes.
Yeah, Dan, the first thing that I want to talk about is the number of firefighters who are dying in the line of duty, if we can, for just a minute, because I think that really puts a very fine point on the criticality of these standards. In May of this year, on the weekend of May 4th and 5th of this year, the National Fallen Firefighters Foundation added 226 firefighters to the wall, the memorial wall in Emmitsburg, 226 for 2023, and then obviously some in previous years. But, over the course of the last 20 years, and that's how long it's been since the foundation's 16 life safety initiatives came into being. Believe it or not, it's been 20 years. the fire service has made amazing progress in some aspects of reducing preventable line of duty deaths, particularly traumatic deaths and vehicular deaths. And today, for example, you hear story after story of near miss incidents where apparatus is struck out on the highway, but the personnel survive. And those are all, in my mind, success stories of survival, right? But there are two areas where we are not making progress. The first one is around cardiovascular deaths. We have literally made no progress in that area of reducing preventable line of duty deaths, particularly of firefighters who don't get an annual medical evaluation. And the leading cause of occupational death now among firefighters is cancer. And so what we're really focusing on is the need to continue to reduce preventable line of duty deaths. And so, yes, in this particular set of regulations, you do see a very concerted effort to put into place and adopt by reference standards that are designed to do those things. So, for example, I believe that there are approximately 20 NFPA standards that are referenced, that are proposed for adoption by reference in this proposed regulations. But let me stop for a minute and just talk about how important the details are about these adoptions by reference. OSHA needs to know from the fire service, all aspects of the fire service, the industrial fire service, the private fire service, the public fire service, the volunteer, the career fire service, the wildland fire service. OSHA needs to hear how specific components of specific standards might impact their organization. And I'll give you an example, and it's a personal example for my department, right? So NFPA 1710 talks about, assembling a certain number of firefighters within a certain amount of time for a given hazard. And the reality is that I have 17 firefighters on duty at any given moment in the city of Harrisonburg. It doesn't matter whether I'm responding to a commercial building fire of 1 million square feet or a single family dwelling bungalow fire of 800 square feet. I'm sending the same 17 firefighters to that incident for initial stabilization and initial response. And so there are aspects of 1710 that do concern me because I won't be able to meet that expectation. OSHA adopts that standard without any comment or edits. A very simple comment for that would be to require fire departments, jurisdictions, fire brigades to define what their capabilities are in terms of providing an initial effective response force and then meet that standard once it is defined. And the overwhelming majority, although there are numerous NFPA standards referenced in the document, this is at its core a performance-based regulation, meaning it is up to individual entities to define for themselves what services they plan to provide, and then the applicable standards come into force. So, for example, I do not provide any underwater rescue services in my community. Therefore, the regulations relative to that would simply not apply. And so I think it's really important for people to have a clear understanding of what the standards do and do not communicate. I hope that helps.
Yeah. So the way I hear you say that, and Ken, you can jump in here too, correct me if I'm wrong. I'm an industrial firefighter, fire chief. I follow 1910-156. Our biggest NFPA standard that we follow is NFPA 1081, interior, exterior. So for my organization, based off what you just said, I need to go back, and even though there's 20 NFPA standards referenced in these new changes, right currently, or where we're at today, I need to go back and I need to look and see what hazards I have at my location. And some of these standards may not apply, is what you're saying. Just the reference you said about water rescue. So that number 20 NFPA standard it is a lot when you're going from one OSHA standard to now these. But I guess what you're saying is, hey, pull it back just a little bit. Let's look and see exactly what our hazards are, and see which standard falls into those hazards. Is that
that's exactly right, Dan. There are, I can't think, a good example, right? In an industrial fire setting would most likely not be involved in wildland firefighting, right? And as long as their industrial fire brigade remains within the confines of the facility, operating in an environment where wildland urban interface does not exist, then the wildland regulations would not apply. And, it really is important for entities to carefully evaluate what services they intend to provide within their communities. And then, based on that, determine which standards are going to apply to them. Now, I can't underscore, how important some of these standards are in addressing preventable line of duty deaths. And that's why, there is no way to, get around the true focus of these regulations.
And I'm going to speak for the industrial industry just for a little bit. Private organizations are very hard on themselves when it comes to safety. It's if you have a industrial fire department, whether it's a full-time dedicated emergency response team, or if it's a hybrid or something like that, then you already know that there's a lot of hazards on site. So a lot of our industry putting this together, looking at those hazards, are already going to say, hey, we already do that. Okay, we do that in-house, so we're not going to go have to either pay for it or go knock on our local fire department's door and say, hey, we're going to need you on this. So I think so a lot of those things, I think maybe already the box is already checked when it comes to safety, because private organizations are a brand. And so you don't want a page of the news. You want to be able to respond quickly. And that's what we do where I'm at.
And I really got to give credit, Dan. I got to be honest with you, Chief. I got to give a tremendous amount of credit to the industrial world, because they especially in the private sector, because they really do spend a huge amount of time investing in workplace safety, because that means that product continues to get produced, and processes continue to operate uninterrupted, and that's essential. And I think these standards are really designed to dovetail very effectively into supporting that overarching goal of keeping industry in the business of doing what they do extremely well, which is producing things in this country safely.
Exactly. I think one of the good, thanks for sharing that. I think another thing this thing's going to do that we're not really looking at is this is going to tighten the relationship up with whatever local fire departments you've got in your area for the industrial side. This is definitely starting the conversation, and usually those relationships are already there, but now this is just going to, I think, build a stronger relationship. Ken, do you agree with everything that Chief's just talked about?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, no, I thought that was a good summary of everything. The only thing I would add is not from the industrial perspective. I mean, you all are covered under 1910-156. I think for those folks who are part of municipal or volunteer fire departments, it's important to know whether or not your state has a state OSHA plan or you're part of federal OSHA, because in some cases, this may not affect you. So it's important to have a discussion with your town lawyer or with your lawyer and ask them directly, like, hey, how does this really affect us? Because I think that'll help address some concerns that people have. The first question should be, well, what is this? The second question should be, how does this really affect my department? And then from there, I think you'll be able to make good decisions going forward, and they can hopefully be able to put together helpful comments as OSHA moves forward in the process.
Thanks for Ken. So July the 22nd is when we got these have to be in. Do either one of you anticipate anything that's, for example, somebody could we see we've got 20 NFPA standards referenced? Is it highly likely, unlikely that somebody's going to say, why wasn't this one in there? I recommend, this standard. So now we go from 20 to maybe 25. Could that happen?
Dan, I got to say, I think that's relatively unlikely. I think that OSHA has done a very good job of looking at the NFPA standards and determining which ones are relevant and applicable within the emergency services community. So I'd be a little surprised, quite honestly, to see additional standards referenced. I think there is, we talked about this briefly. There's a lot of fear around these new regulations, and fear of the unknown, fear of change, fear of impact. And I understand those, and I think that's why the process is so purposeful, to give people a time to process their fear, move past the rhetoric that there's a lot of energy around, and start getting to the content. And, in this case, I think it's, I don't anticipate additional regulations or additional standards being recommended. I certainly see an opportunity for a lot of editing and, a lot of revision. Quite honestly, I do not expect any final rules that may be proposed within the next, in the 2 to 3 year timeline. I simply do not expect those to resemble what we are seeing today. I don't think that they're going to be wholesale different, but I do think you're going to see an effort to be as responsive as possible as OSHA possibly can be.
Chief, the only thing I'd add is I don't think you'll see more standards, but I think de facto you'll end up seeing a lesser number of standards. One of the things that we're going to comment on is the fact that NFPA is in the process of consolidating its standards. So, and I think they discussed this in their rulemaking. This is one of the issues which OSHA is going to have to address, is the fact that when OSHA adopts a standard, it's in there and it's there for good. And I guess there's two parts. One, that's the reason why the OSHA 1910-156 standard hasn't changed since 1980, because it's really hard to go through the rulemaking to update everything. But then two, there's always the possibility that you've basically frozen something in space. So if they adopt a standard and put it into the regulation, that's what it is. So that's something which we intend to raise for OSHA to have to consider. Obviously, right now, we're in a world where the different risks the fire service is facing is transforming. We're having to deal with lithium batteries and electric vehicles. They're talking about in the future, we're going to have hydrogen vehicles on the road. All this stuff, we're going to have to have NFPA is going to be updating their standards. And then OSHA is going to have to figure out what they're going to do in terms of implementing and enforcing their regulation to make sure it doesn't come out of date. That's one issue when we talk about incorporating by reference that we intend to raise and that OSHA kind of have to deal with. The other thing, too, is there's other standards out there that I think OSHA will have to look at. For example, the National Wildfire Coordinating Group actually creates standards for wildland fires and wildland fire suppression operations. And so one of the things which we will probably end up recommending is that OSHA, not only looking at NFPA standards, but especially in the wildland arena, they're going to have to look at also adopting the NWCG standards. Otherwise, the wildland world's going to be kind of confused. So, yeah.
And so thanks for bringing up the consolidation. So information still may be in there, but you're saying the numbers, because we're consolidating NFPA standards, we may go from 20 down to 15, but that doesn't really, all that means is all the information is still in there. We're just pulling, and I'm as a firefighter, I'm thankful that NFPA is consolidating a lot of their standards. I think we had too many to, everybody in every department's got a couple of those guys that can bounce off those NFPA standards. And I'm not one of those guys. So lower, the more we can keep them lower, makes me happy. One thing I want to talk about is what communication. That this is a podcast, definitely communication, but there's also FRI's got this topic is going to be on the agenda. Chief, I think you're part of that. Ken, I'm sure you're part of that too with the IFC. So you want to talk? Can you talk a little bit about that, Chief?
Yeah, no problem. Obviously, this is a very hot topic. And the IFC, I do want to talk about the fact that, and Ken is incredibly, self-effacing about this, but, the IFC is the most diverse fire service leadership organization in the world. With all of our sections and all of our divisions, we are a Big Ten entity. And so we don't speak monolithically, we don't think monolithically, and we don't act monolithically. We do share the common goals of safety, education, and leadership, of course. But, the IFC is going through this very purposeful process of gathering comments because we don't look at this as the lens of a single thought process. And so it does take a little longer to accomplish that, the collection and assimilation of that information. But ultimately, I think the IFC is truly fulfilling its mission through this team of people that are looking at it. And it's an open, transparent process that I think is important for all of our folks to be aware of. But at Fire Rescue International, we'll have an opportunity to probably fill a room and talk about this from the perspective of where are we today, how did we get here, and where are we going into the future. And we look forward to that. And I'll be leading a session on that while we're at Fire Rescue International. Obviously, I know that Ken and I will be running all over Dallas while we're there to answer questions. But I also know that we'll be available to the various sections and divisions that might want us to come in and answer specific questions. The really important thing that I think for anyone listening to podcasts or webinars or sitting in on presentations is to carefully evaluate the individuals who are speaking on the topic and what their backgrounds are and what their motivations might be. And that's not to assign a value, but everyone is a product of their lived experience. And so when you're talking about this, when someone is standing up on a stage and talking about this topic, it's just really important to first vet them and carefully identify what their background is, what their motivations might be, what their concerns are. And then ask insightful questions, like ask probing questions. Don't take anything I say for gospel. Don't take anything that someone says for gospel. Ask insightful questions, ground truth the information, and then form an educated opinion about what might be going on.
Yeah, Chief, the only thing I would add to that is basically, I think some folks are acting like this is the end of the story and they need to go to their department and tomorrow they're supposed to implement all this stuff. It's more like, I think the chief would probably put it as we're on a journey. What we need to do at this point is be submitting good, helpful comments to OSHA. And by helpful, I mean helpful from the fire chief's perspective, not anybody else's. But just like, the chiefs should be looking at this and saying, okay, how is this going to affect me? What are things that I need OSHA to do to make my life easier? And they should be submitting that into the docket. Because that's really what the IFC is doing. We're looking at this as a perspective of, what can we do to make life easier for fire chiefs as this thing goes forward? And when it eventually becomes regulation, which you're never 100% sure it's going to happen, but let's assume that it is going to become regulation. How can we have OSHA drafted in a way that saves lives, makes it easier for firefighters to do their job safely, and also makes it easy for the department to be able to implement it in ways that are not going to destroy their budgets? So as you can see, that's not an easy goal, but that's kind of where we are coming from. And I think if fire chiefs at home take a look at that and pursue that and submit comments to OSHA, then they'll actually have to literally every comment that gets submitted, they have to go through and figure out how to answer it. So usually when you see the final comment comes out, you'll see the fire chief's organization said X, Y, and Z. Well, OSHA decided, yes, we'll take that, but we won't take this because of A, B, and C reason. So, and with all the comments they're going to get, they're going to be really busy going through them. So this is really an opportunity at this point for a fire chief to make his or her life easier by getting comments in today that then OSHA will have to consider and hopefully make life easier a year or two down the road.
Chief, I see you shaking your head there. So
I think that again, where we are is we literally have just left the starting blocks. Anyone who wants to talk about impact first needs to consider that we are very far from impact. We are at the very beginning of this process. And, there's no way to get to the finish line without a starting product, and that's, this is exactly that. This is the starting point of an ongoing journey to reduce preventable line of duty deaths. And yes, it is going to represent change, and change is hard, but change is easier when people truly believe that they are a part of the process. OSHA is asking for us to be part of the process. So that makes change easier. But, at the end of the day, OSHA is, charged with the responsibility of doing everything possible to keep emergency responders safe. And this represents a significant effort in that area.
Good, yes, and it's hard to debate that when we're talking about line of duty deaths. So
it isn't. But here's the thing, right? So, and this is where I'm going to say that I hear people's concerns, right? That if there is so much regulation that it regulates an emergency services organization out of business, then the community doesn't benefit from having no emergency services, provision of services. But the exact same things were asserted when NFPA 1500 was adopted in 1985 and then fully implemented in 1987. The assertion was that it was going to be the end of the American Fire Service. And while I realize it's easy to say that and build on people's fear, that is none of our lived experiences. And so, my observation is we'll figure it out. We're the fire service. We always figure it out. We are the problem solvers. When no one else can get something solved, they call the fire department because we're very good at that. And so we'll figure it out.
Good point.
Chief King, if I can just highlight one thing too, I think there's a general assumption that once this regulation hits the books and becomes a real active promulgated regulation, everybody has to do everything tomorrow. The day after, they're going to have to do all this stuff. No, there's going to be some type of implementation period, but this is really important for fire departments to look at and see if the fire department had to implement what's being proposed, how long would it take to do it? Because that's something which I think OSHA is looking for better information on both in terms of the cost of implementation, but then also how long would it take people to implement it. So again, to make life easier for a fire chief now, see how long it takes. I'm sure there's some departments will be, say, look, 90% of the stuff we're already doing, it's not going to be a problem. Other folks will probably need a year or 2 or 3 or more. And I think at this point, just be realistic to OSHA and say, this is how long we think will take. And then OSHA may end up taking a look at all that and adjusting an implementation period, based on the various inputs that they get. So, but the big thing is, I would just say to fire chiefs, don't freak out. You're not going to have to do all this on day one after the regulations implemented. But the question is, what time do you need to implement these regulations? And then 2, be sure to tell OSHA, that way they can calculate it. So again, make your life easier whenever this becomes actually a real reg.
Yeah. So in the currently where we're at today, and we're talking local fire departments, and we're talking at a state level. For those that are wanting to be proactive on this topic, getting ready for 2 or 3 years and who knows what, is there anything that you would encourage them to do, not do, or what would you tell them?
Yeah, the very first thing that anyone anywhere in the United States does when they look at this regulation is they need to determine first, does it apply to them or not? That's the very first thing, because there are a very, there about half the states in the union are federal OSHA states, which means the regulations do not apply to public service entities in those states. And then if the state does have a state plan, the next question that needs to be answered is, how do they define covered employees? How do they define the term covered employees? Because some states, some states include volunteer firefighters, some do not include volunteer firefighters, and some base the definition of a volunteer firefighter on how or in what way they are compensated for their time and effort in providing service. Because even if you are an OSHA state plan state, volunteer firefighters might be excluded. Let me give you two quick examples. The state of Washington includes volunteers. The state of Maryland excludes volunteers. Both are state plan states. By contrast, Pennsylvania is a federal OSHA state, and so it will have absolutely no impact on public sector entities in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. So that's really the most important thing. The next after that is to recognize that the absolute deadline from OSHA to submit comments is that July 22nd deadline. OSHA did extend the public comment period. I do not anticipate them extending it another time. It's not beyond the realm of possibility. However, I am very skeptical that they would extend the public comment period again. So folks just need to really get engaged, educated, and then really dig into providing constructive comments about cost, and implementation timetables.
Ken, anything to add?
No, I think Chief Tobia hit the nail on the head. I would just say probably the first thing, one is A, don't freak out. And then B, to deal with some of his questions. Consult your local, every fire department has some type of legal counsel. Just go to them and get a quick opinion from them. They can usually tell you pretty quick how the regulation would affect you based on either federal or state OSHA. And then once you got your lawyer telling you how you're affected, then the fire department can make better decisions about, how to proceed in terms of commenting and things like that.
Awesome. Well, again, I covered a lot of information that we didn't cover on the last podcast. So definitely we met our objective. I want to thank both of you. Definitely have the right people in the room on this topic. I want to thank you for going to FRI and spreading this, because it is creating some anxiety in the fire service. What the future holds. So I don't think you talked about a journey. This is a very long journey, and it's not over yet. So thank you for being on the podcast and sharing your what you know about this topic. And I'm sure we'll have a part 3 on this maybe after FRI.
That sounds great, Chief. Thank you so much for the opportunity to come on and continue to educate our members about what the proposed regulations are and what they are not. Just highlighting this effort, this podcast really just is such an important aspect of continuing to educate our members about what they need to know. So thanks for that.
Thank you, Chief.
Yep. I appreciate everybody's time. Thanks, Chief King. Thanks, Chief Tobia.
Until next time.